For the most part today, I think that we've heard a lot of, on the one hand, discussions about individual companies. Well, Eve talked about Rolls-Royce Marine, we just heard about the paper company, and a fair amount of fairly general discussions about, I would say, bordering on the interface between sociology, philosophy, psychology, and a few other things in between that have to do with motivation and understanding about how business enterprises actually work. The talk that I'm interested in presenting today is none of that. It's something in between, if you like, and it's really focused on trying to understand business as a science. And one of the crucial aspects of any kind of actual science is the ability to do controlled, repeatable experiments to test hypotheses. Now, in the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, even biology to some degree, this is almost taken for granted from the time of, say, Galileo, that you want to study billiard balls or planets or electrons or elementary particles, that you construct laboratories of some type, and you use these laboratories to test hypotheses, to do experiments, and to do repeatable experiments. Now, it's a sad, one of the many sad facts in life, that in the areas that we most care about in daily life, the systems of everyday life, this kind of experimentation is exactly what you cannot do. If you have a theory of finance, you cannot go down to Wall Street and ask them to change the rules today to test your theory. And even if you could never repeat the same experiment. Similarly with road traffic problems, communication networks, healthcare delivery systems, paper companies, engine manufacturing firms, or whatever. The systems that we most care about, the ones that I think of as the most important examples of complex, and I'm afraid I have to use the old terminology, complex adaptive systems. I like CAS, I'm sure you understand. They are beyond the bounds of this kind of experimentation. And so it's very difficult in the social behavioral realm to think about following the dictates of the scientific method to create something that looks like a decent scientific theory of these processes if you don't have laboratories to do experiments, to test hypotheses. Well, fortunately, to some degree, technology is starting to come to our rescue just at the moment we actually hate it the most, but need it the most. And in this particular instance, it comes to our rescue by providing us with the kind of cheap, powerful computational capabilities to try to create electronic copies of the systems that we most care about inside our computers and use the computer as a laboratory for doing experimentation. Roughly speaking, in my view, this is what agent-based models are about. They're about exactly the doing of experiments. So in this talk this afternoon, I want to, first of all, tell Mika that my hands are not quite as clean as he might believe. They have been and will be again dirty. I wash them every now and then, mostly to my computer keyboard. When I write books, it doesn't like hands that are too dirty, so they have to be cleaned up, but they get dirty again. And today you'll see an example of one of those cases. And so I call this, well, it's not on this overhead, but the title of the talk, The World of Business in a Box. And I want to show you that box. I have it right here in my pocket. Here it is. This is the world of business in a box. And you see it's not a very big box. So there's a lot of and you can even do things like put it around your neck, if I can get it past this microphone. There it is. I'll wear it for the rest of this talk. And the idea is to, as I say, use the computer as a laboratory. Now, this actually is even more revolutionary than you might imagine if you think a bit philosophically. Because some of you may have seen a few years ago a book by Stephen Wolfram called A New Kind of Science. Now, interestingly enough, this book was almost uniformly hated by everyone in the complex systems business. I actually wrote the review of this book for Nature magazine, and I didn't hate it as much as some of my colleagues in Santa Fe did. It actually had some very redeeming qualities, and the most important part of that book is the title, A New Kind of Science. And what I'm describing today, and what Stephen Wolfram tried to use 900 pages to describe, is, in my view, definitely a new kind of science. And it actually goes back a couple thousand years or more to the time of Aristotle. Those of you who remember your Aristotelian philosophy, at least part of it, you'll know that Aristotle claimed that if you ask a question, why, that there were 4 different ways to answer that question. They're called Aristotle's causal categories, causes. Because a question that starts with why, the answer always begins with because. And there are 4 ways of stating because. One of them Aristotle claimed was what we call material cause. My house is the way it is because of the matter of which it's composed, stone, wood, or whatever. Second way of answering why is this house this way and not something else is efficient cause, which is roughly energy. It's because of this, your house looks this way because of the energy that the workers put into constructing it this way. And those 2 causes are, roughly speaking, the way that, I'll say, classical science, especially the natural sciences, answers questions. And the laboratories of the natural sciences are focused on exploring the material and energetic structure of systems. Think about a particle accelerator, for example. But Aristotle had 2 additional causes. The third one was formal causation. Formal causation has to do with essentially information. Your house is this way because of the blueprint, the plan by which the architect designed this kind of a house and not a different one. And this is where I think I'd like to grandly call it science Santa Fe style starts to enter into traditional science on equal footing. Because when you use the computer as a laboratory for doing experiments, what you're really exploring is not the material or energetic structure of a system. You're looking at its information structure. How the information relates one piece to another. And this is what Stephen Wolfram had in mind when he titled his book, A New Kind of Science. So while there's many things to complain about in that book, the basic idea is very sound. There is a new kind of science that's now emerging. And it is bringing into the scientific worldview, if you like, for the first time in history, the third Aristotelian cause, formal causation, on an equal footing with matter and energy. And of course, this raises the obvious question, what about the 4th cause? Aristotle's 4th category of causation, which is now we call it final causation. And it has to do with purpose or desire, will, if you like, your house is this way and not some other way because I wanted a house that looked like this or was structured in this way. Now, this will be a great challenge, maybe the challenge of the 21st century, is to fold in, if you like, into an overall view of the world on equal footing with matter, energy, and information, purpose and will, desire. And I don't know how that's going to be done. I have a sense it's probably tied up with issues of like consciousness. But for the moment, let's stay with the third cause, formal causation. And I want to tell you not only a couple of stories, but give you an example, a dirty hands example of how this is actually, how complexity science, if you like, has actually been used to address some questions of concern in the business world. So let's see here, what's next? Yes. Well, this little picture is really designed more than anything else to try and separate out the notions of complication from the idea of complexity. Because very often, I think these two things are confused, especially in everyday language. And I'm not completely convinced that this picture helps unconfuse them, but at least it's my view of some of the differences between something just being complicated, like a mechanical clock, and you take it apart, you see gears and wheels and springs and so on, but I don't think that we would call it complex for all of them. But that question has already been discussed to some degree, so I don't want to spend much time on that. Now here's a example of a combination, complex and complicated system. Many of you may remember this crisis a few years ago from it was a currency crisis in Mexico that propagated out from a Mexican peso crisis through a variety of different countries in South America, and to this day, Argentina is suffering dramatically because of the consequences of this diagram, if you like. So there are some very important long-term effects that sort of explode through the course of a system if you push it in the wrong way, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Now, here's a small list of complex, adaptive / evolving systems. They happen to be ones that I myself have had some dealings with through the past years, and I'm sure everyone in this room could dramatically add to this list. The main point of this list is not the specific systems that I put up here, but the fact that the complex adaptive systems, these are the systems of everyday life. There are no simple systems. If you deal with real systems in the real world, you're dealing with complex systems. The only simple systems are in textbooks, and not very good textbooks. If you want to come to terms with real problems in the real world, then you have to face up to the challenge of dealing with what we call today complex systems. Complex adaptive systems even. Here's my favorite example. Now here's a real world example, a football game. And this picture is actually a screen capture from one of my computers that I was doing some very deep experimentation on the Super Bowl football game a few years ago, trying to decide how it was that I should place my bets for this game. And since there is no good mathematical theory for this kind of process, I had to resort to something that I did know, which was play this game a few thousand times inside my computer and do some analysis of what happened now. And if you want to know how this experiment came out, it's the opening section of chapter 1 of a book I wrote a few years ago called Would-Be Worlds, which, in fact, I'm happy to mention that here in Finland because the title from that book came from a suggestion from a student from Tampere University in Finland. At the time I was writing the book, it had a working title. It's a book about computer simulation and agent-based models. And I had this working title, Counterfeit Worlds, that I never liked at all. I didn't like this title because counterfeit always suggests something that's not of true value, something kind of fake that you're trying to sell as the real thing. Well, that wasn't my intention at all, but I couldn't think of any better title. And one day I was in an institute, the Institute for Future Studies, actually, but it happened to be in Stockholm, not in Helsinki. And I was sitting in the coffee room talking to the director, Ake Andersson from Stockholm, and some Finnish people came, a Finnish professor, and he had 3 students with him, 3 young ladies actually. And Ake Andersson said, "Oh, why don't you tell them about this book that you're working on now?" And so I described a bit what I was trying to do. And one of these students, a woman named Hannah Allen, actually, she said, "Oh," she said, "you mean a would-be world?" And I said, "That's it. That's exactly what I mean, a would-be world." So that title came from Finland. The book came from America, but the title came from Finland. But in any case, a football game is a good example of a complex adaptive system, and here are some of the characteristics that all of the systems that were on that previous list share with a football game. A medium-sized number of agents making up the system. In that case, it were the players in the game. It could be traders in a financial market. It could be animals in an evolutionary ecosystem. It could be firms in an industry. But there are a medium-sized number of them. So that means there's not such a small number that you can sort of work out all the interactions on a back-of-the-envelope calculation. And it's not such a big number that you can statistically aggregate them into higher level quantities that tell you anything that you really want to know about the system. So what is a medium-sized number? Well, it's certainly bigger than 2. Think about it in physics. You have the n-body problem. And we know that when n is only 2, talking about planets or objects moving in each other's gravitational field, and asking, is there some formula that will tell you, if you give the position and velocity at time 0, where everything will be at some future time? Well, we know if you only have 2 bodies, then you can work this out explicitly. As soon as you have 3 or more, then there's no formulas for doing that. So a medium-sized number is certainly bigger than 2. On the other end of the scale, also think about classical physics. If you have a bottle full of gas, there's a liter, let's say, of gas. There's about 10 to the 23rd molecules of gas moving around inside this bottle. And in principle, if you knew the position and velocity of each of these molecules at time 0, you could do a calculation and keep track of where all of them were going to be in the future. We also know that we never do that, because since the time of Boltzmann, we know that you can statistically aggregate all of these quantities, because they're all homogeneous objects, to higher level quantities that we call pressure, temperature. And we have a relationship that links these higher level quantities, the ideal gas law, PV equals nRT. So you don't have to calculate what each of the objects are doing. You can statistically aggregate and talk about all the quantities that you usually care about. What's the pressure? What's the temperature? So a medium-sized number then is certainly less than 10 to the 23rd. So it's somewhere in between, greater than 2 and less than 10 to the 23rd. So I think that we'll all agree that that leaves considerable scope for most systems that we encounter in everyday life. And in fact, in general, the right size is usually a few dozen to a few 100,000. That's a medium-sized number. So in a football game, you have, at least American football, and in European football, you have 22. That's the number. The second property, intelligent and adaptive. Intelligent here is in a very, I mean it in a very low-level sense. It's not intelligent in the sense of being able to figure your way through mazes and add up long columns of numbers or things of that kind. It simply means that the objects that make up the system, they use rules. At any given moment, they decide what action to take. If you're a driver, you decide to speed up, slow down, or whatever, on the basis of rules. And you're continually monitoring your rules to see, are they producing results that you're satisfied with? So if you're a trader at Citibank, a currency trader, and you're using some kind of rules to decide whether to buy or sell or hold, and if you're making money, then you stay with that rule. But if all of a sudden your rule stops working, then you change to a different rule. Or perhaps even invent some new rule that never existed before. And so you're always exploring, let's say, in this space of rules. And that's what the intelligent part means. I probably should have put it in quotes. And the adaptive part means just what you think it means. You can change to a new rule. If you don't like your current rule, you can change to something else. And that's just exactly what you cannot do in the natural sciences. Planets and electrons don't change their rules. And the very essence of research in those areas is mostly focused on trying to understand what rule are they using. But they certainly don't change their rules. So in this sense, you could certainly make the claim that physics in general is a kind of special case of biology. It's the case where the objects never change their rules. I mean, a lot of physicists like to think it's the other way around, that biology is a special case of physics when you get the initial conditions right, but I think it's just the opposite, that physics is much simpler than biology by several orders of magnitude. And finally, local information. That just means that there's no object that knows what everyone else is doing. Just that simple. That every football player on the field, for example, they know what some of the other players are doing, but they don't know what all of them are doing. And in the same thing when you're driving your car out on the streets of Helsinki. You know what some of the drivers in your vicinity are doing, but you don't know what everybody in the system is doing. Sometimes it matters, sometimes not. Okay, now let me shift to talking about how to use the computer as a laboratory to understand, and some of the motivations for using it to understand problems in the business world. So this slide is sort of in the category of propaganda, actually. It's here to give you some motivation for why it's a useful thing to consider building these electronic copies of real-world systems inside your computer for various purposes in business in context. Now, the next picture is actually, I think, more important. This is a list of requirements for constructing an effective agent-based model. One that can actually be useful in the setting of a real business. See, it doesn't do any good, for example, to create a world that nobody understands, or that only the programmers or the developers can use, or that it takes 5 years in order to put it together, there are a lot of conditions here that I've listed that have nothing to do with the actual techniques of creating such worlds, the programming language you use, or any of these kinds of technical issues. These are practical considerations. These are the rules that if you violate, you're not going to have any customers for your company, because they want to see things that are easy to use. They don't take forever. It doesn't take days to do a simulation, that it can be developed in a relatively short time, that people understand, the users actually understand what this world is actually trying to tell them, and so forth. So in some ways, from a practical business point of view, if you want to translate ideas and tools of complexity science into practical tools that people in the business community will actually use, this is the single most important slide in this whole presentation. Because all of these, you can if you run afoul of any one of the items on this list, you're not going to have many customers. Now, here, for the rest of this talk, I want to give you a real-world example of how this methodology, if you want to term it that, is used. And it has to do with a problem in the world catastrophe insurance industry. A few years ago, I went to a meeting, giving a talk in Bermuda. And it was a meeting convened by a lot of the world's catastrophe insurers, or actually the reinsurers, the companies that insure the insurance companies. They're headquartered in Bermuda for tax reasons. And they wanted to try to have some understanding about what can the science of today tell us that will help our industry. Because they'd all seen, all these finance houses and so on, grabbing up all these physicists and taking them to Wall Street, because the brokers thought that it would be possible to use physics as a tool for making money, and to some degree it was. But the insurers, they have even more money than the banks. So they were hopeful that science could say something useful for them as well. And at this meeting in Bermuda, there were 4 people speaking, myself and 3 others, and the others were all climatologists, every single one of them. They were climatologists. And what this said was that the insurers thought that the single most important thing for their industry that science could offer to them would be better methods for predicting hurricanes. Better methods. See, these people were in the catastrophe insurance business. They insured you for earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, windstorms, that kind of thing. Major events. And I thought, well, this is pretty interesting that the insurers think that this is the single most important thing that science might offer them, because when you think about it logically, I thought, in fact, I don't know if it was a mistake or not, but I stated this. Fortunately, in that meeting, I was also the last one to speak. It's sometimes nice to have the last word as well as the first word. I said, suppose that you had a perfect method for predicting hurricanes, 100% effective, that would never fail. It was an exact method for predicting hurricanes. This is the worst thing that could happen to the insurance industry. I said, you'll all be out of business. The very essence of your business is uncertainty, not certainty. And if you can predict hurricanes perfectly, you're not going to have any customers. So that's bad, to have a perfect method for predicting hurricanes. And you say, and what about the other end of the scale? Suppose you know nothing. You have no way of judging the likelihood or unlikelihood of a hurricane of a certain magnitude striking in some place. Now, that's bad also, because you don't have any way to rationally decide what to charge your customers. What price should you charge for the premium if you have no idea of what the risk is? So, logically, there's some optimal level of uncertainty. between complete ignorance and total knowledge at which your industry is the most healthy. Well, where is it? Where is that level of uncertainty? Well, nobody knows. But I suggested that with the technology that we had available at that time, this was in, I don't remember exactly, 7 or 8 years ago, that we should be able to construct a copy of your industry inside our computers with the customers who buy insurance, the primary insurers who basically issue the policies, take the risks for different kinds of hazards in different areas, and the reinsurers who buy some of the risk. If you think that you are overexposed on hurricanes, if you have too much exposure for hurricanes in the Gulf Coast, you can sell some of that risk to the reinsurers for a price. So there's a complicated dynamic. The players, if you like, the agents in this world, were the management of these various companies. And I said, suppose, and what kind of questions, suppose you had this kind of world in your computer, what kind of questions could you address? Well, you could certainly address the question that I posed a moment ago. Should it be worth to you to have a method of predicting hurricanes that's more effective than what you're using today? How much should you be willing to pay for such an increased accuracy? Or suppose you drop a force 5 hurricane on Miami Beach, which almost happened a few months ago, actually, or it almost happened to New Orleans, but same story. Who are the winners and who are the losers? Because this is an event that would cost billions and billions of dollars of damage. The insurance companies, for sure, they don't have enough money to pay off. So there's many people who think they have insurance for their houses that are going to discover their houses will not get rebuilt because their insurance company has vanished. And who are they? Who are the companies? And I was talking to some you girls yesterday about the ecosystem of business. Well, some companies will vanish. They'll become extinct. And that means new eco-niches open up. And what kind of companies are going to come in to fill these niches? Just like in biology, when species go extinct. So there are a whole spectrum of questions of this type that if you have this world in your computer, you can do experiments and test. So, and I'll tell you truthfully, there were several hundred people in this audience, and my own guess is that this message, maybe 90% of the people in the audience found this message literally incomprehensible. Incomprehensible. They were focused on hurricanes, and they didn't want to hear about simulations or their industry or anything else. They wanted to know, can we predict hurricanes? But fortunately, there was another 10%. And so here are some of them. I, over the next few months, had many conversations with several people, both in the insurance and reinsurance business and technical people. And we formed a consortium. The companies that are listed here in capital letters, they are the companies. They're in capital letters because they paid the money to finance this operation. And the ones in lowercase, we were the worker bees. We actually produced this world, which is called Insurance World, but the process was extremely interesting and important. The deal was the companies could join the consortium. They had to pay some money. It wasn't a very big sum. I think they each paid $25,000. But more importantly, they had to agree to meet with us 5 times during the course of a 1-year period and provide their professional expertise for how the insurance and reinsurance industry actually worked. I mean, we knew how to build simulations, but we didn't know anything about insurance, and certainly not about catastrophe insurance. So we had a meeting, the organizational meeting we actually held in London. at a company, well, Greg Fest, it's now called Benfield Greg. But, and so we all met and discussed how this might look. We went back to Santa Fe and built a kind of initial approximation to this world. A couple of months later, we met again in Bermuda. And in the meantime, we had sent out this preliminary version of this world to our partners for critique, so they could play with it and come and give us some sensible feedback. Well, they gave us a long list in Bermuda of everything they thought was wrong with this world. And so, and it was a pretty long list, really. And we went back to Santa Fe and tried to plug all these holes and create the next version, which we sent out. And then we met again a month or so later in, I think it was Zurich, and went through the same process again. And unfortunately, we got a list of problems from the, it was longer than the first list, but at least it wasn't the same list, it was just longer. And so we went back to Santa Fe and tried to fix that. But by the end, the list, it was not zero, unfortunately, but it was down to a size that there wasn't anybody who thought that this world was really great or perfect. It didn't exactly reflect their view of the industry, but it reflected all the important pieces. And so part of the deal was that the supporters of the project, they got to have this world, and they could take it back to their own companies and tailor it and structure it. But the most important part was they participated in the process. And without exception, all of the people from the companies told us afterwards that that was, what did they get out of this exercise? They got out of it a deeper understanding of how their own industry works, because they were forced to confront questions about what do you do under these circumstances, and why do you do it, and how do you do it. And and because the computer was very unforgiving, it didn't know anything about insurance, and it needed instructions. And that was the real benefit of this process. So here were some of the kinds of questions that the people in the industry wanted to know about. The last one is the most important one. Many other questions. And so here I've already told you this, how the process was, the actual process of building this world. Here are some of the a few of the pieces in it. It was a kind of toy world. It wasn't intended ever to be a high fidelity version of the real world. It was only intended to encompass the most important features of the real world. I mean, whenever you build models, you have to throw away many aspects of the real world. What we threw away were these a lot of the detail, but the logic was all the same. You know, a few markets for hurricanes and earthquakes, economy, 5 primary insurers, 5 reinsurers, and so on, to scale it up to real world levels. Everything here would have to be multiplied by roughly a factor of 10. But the logic would still be the same. It would just take a lot longer to run these simulations. So here are a few of the pieces that are in this world. It's actually a bit more elaborate than this, but these were mostly everything I could fit on one slide. But it gives you the general idea that there were a variety of components that had to be fit together. And each one of those arrows, there was a certain kind of logic that had to be written in for what happens in the let's say that red box, that one, everything converges there. That essentially is the return on capital. But every one of these had to have some feedback from people in the industry for what it is that actually happens in their world. in order to make it sensible. We didn't make it up. So here's one of the many kinds of things that you might see if you do, one of these runs, the way that we structured it, the timing, it was a kind of intermediate term time horizon. One time step was 3 months, 1 quarter. So for 10 years, we had 40 time steps. That would constitute 1 run. It was a long enough period of time that things like inflation, interest rates, and other things could change, but not so long that that it took a long time to run. And it was just about the right time scale as far as the insurers were concerned. I mean, they weren't interested in a world that ran on a day-by-day basis. 1 quarter was about right. Maybe it could have been 1 month, but a quarter was about right. And this little picture that I'm showing you here, it happens to be the equity in the firms. You see the 5 firms along the right. We even gave them real names: Zurich, Allstate, State Farm, Prudential, and Nationwide. And you can see what happened in this particular case. One of the firms, the last one, Nationwide, it went out of business. It became extinct after 3 years. The reason it became extinct is that it had, at that period in, nature stepped in and produced a big hurricane in Japan, I think it was. And that company had taken on lots of risk, and this hurricane came too soon for them. That was another interesting feature, because as long as nothing is happening, you're just collecting premiums, and you're not paying out anything. And this is another one of the problems that they have to deal with: how to invest this money, because you don't know when something is going to happen, and you might have to have your hands on a big chunk of money real quick if you have an earthquake or a hurricane. So you don't want to put it into investments that are very long term, that you have to pay a penalty to take the money out. And this company, it did not diversify, and it did not sell some of its risk to the reinsurers. So when this hurricane struck, it was too soon. They had not accumulated enough capital to be able to pay off, and they just went out of business. So the people in Japan who were insured by that company, they didn't get their houses rebuilt. That was but the other companies, they more or less stayed about the same as when they started, except for the first one, Zurich, which happened to be lucky that they didn't have any major casualties in this time period that Zurich was responsible for. So their shareholders were happy. But there are many different pictures of this kind and many different scenarios that can be played with, so that if you're a manager of one of these big companies like Swiss Re or Zurich or whatever, you can say, what action should I take today to not only ensure that my company is going to be a survivor of one of these kind of disasters, but maybe even a beneficiary, that I'm going to become the dinosaur of the insurance business, the living dinosaur, not the dead one, in the future times. So the point of this whole exercise, and later I can tell you how they use this, at least some of them, they used it mostly as a training tool, like a flight simulator. I don't know about whether any of them actually developed it further in order to use it on any kind of day-to-day basis, but they certainly used it to give insight to especially new employees as to the kinds of things that can happen in certain sets of circumstances. So that was the main value was the process in its construction and its use as a kind of, as I say, like a flight simulator to understand the dynamics and the interplay of the different players, the different components of the catastrophe insurance industry. And I'm quite sure that this same kind of exercise, we've done it several times, not just with insurers. I think that Yves mentioned that my company Complexica in Santa Fe, which has now spun off two other companies, one called Complexica and one called Assuratech, and they all do this same kind of thing, but it has to be done individually for particular customers. You know, there's no one-size simulation that fits all. You need to have the expert input from the customer. It's really a collaborative venture, just like with your work. You can't just go and sit in your office and become an expert by reading a book about the insurance business. Okay, so I think that it's been a long day, and this is a good time to finish this off. Here's a final picture that is, again, more in the category of propaganda than anything else, but still, it gives you some motivation for why it is that this brand of medicine, if you like, this kind of technology is useful in a commercial context. Okay, I don't know if this presentation is part of the handouts or not. I can't remember. But if anybody wants to have a copy of these overheads, just let me know. They're in this computer, and Ali can, so send a message to me or to Ali, and she'll send you this information. Simulations, okay. Like there was one done in agent-based model in Santa Fe. It was a stock market. And it had no mathematics in it, really. There were just kind of trading rules that said if the average price over the last 6 weeks has been at this level, then you buy this many shares, otherwise you sell. Or if the market is in this condition, then you go out for a while. They're sort of if-then type just rules. And it wasn't any mathematics of any kind. So I think it depends on the situation, which category, it belongs in. And I don't, to be honest with you, I don't think the category matters very much, whether you call it a simulation or an agent-based model. What matters is whether it answers questions that you care about.
And in one sense, whether you can play with it.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
My name is Norma Bakori. I'm from Inigo Consulting Facilitator. What is the price of this, the total cost of this simulation you described, this particular insurance case?
$200,000 in 1996 dollars. Cheaper now. The dollar's weakened a lot since those days. If it was to be done by a commercial company, we did it over a period of 1 year because we had other things to do. It wasn't a full-time job. If a commercial company were going to do it, like a company that I have in Santa Fe, the price would be about the same, maybe $250,000, but you would get it in 3 months, not 1 year. So we would focus, we would give you our undivided attention.
I would like to add something about you said about this agent-based something. I'm coming from the community which is neuroelectric fuzzy logic and evolutionary algorithm for coevolution simulation. And I'm only on a daily basis faced with these problems. In fact, what you were talking about was an approximation of a function, of an unknown function, or put it other way. I think, but I don't know much more, I don't know many, I don't have any information about the model. But in fact, you have to do modeling of the human behavior. And modeling of the human behavior, or group of human behavior, is very complex. My lab was involved in one project which was supported by EU. It was Network of Excellence called Unite. And it was promoting intelligent technologies. And within such a world competition which was focused to try to simulate behavior of the client of the selected commercial bank. So we went to the bank, we had a very good relation with the bank, and the bank told us that we need somehow categorize the type of the client. In fact, he was, I mean, the guy, the person from the bank, was so wise that he was able to set up, I think around 25 or 26 features. And by the help of these features, he described each client. Now, we put up, and these data are on the net, so it's possible to download. And the categorization was based on learning and supervised classification. That means that they marked good clients or clients only, the clients which are shifting to different banks. And on the end of the day, they wanted to create a system which will be automatically able to warn the bank that, hey, this group of clients is behaving like they would like to move somewhere else or leave the bank. And modeling of the behavior of such a clients was not easy. But we ended up on the classification rate was around 70%, 70-80%. That means that simply they were able to get a tool. Well, there are different types of tools, and I mean these people around the world, they were using neural networks, fuzzy rules. I mean these rules what you were talking about, it's integral for creating the fuzzy rules for data mining approaches. And this what was, I mean, a very good school for me was that what is most difficult in this business is this communication with the company. Because you are not selling the plug-and-play system, you are selling a solution. And so from that point of view, it is very crucial if the company which you are working for is able, is willing to cooperate with you, with a group, with a lab. But I would like to end up, these are comments, I would like to end up to two questions that if the system that you are selling is the system which are adapting to new situations. That's the first question. And second, I mean, that's very crucial. How do you measure the quality of the system?
The issue of the customers, or let's say the modeling human behavior, if you want. I mean, that of course, as I'm sure that you were suggesting, it depends upon how much of the human behavior you have to model depends on the questions that this world is designed to address. So, for example, if you're creating a road traffic network and drivers and travelers in the system, it's very important to understand the psychology of different types of drivers. And it's important to know, for example, the demographics. Where do they live? Where do they shop? Where do they work? Where do their children go to school? And so on. But it's not important to know about the color of their hair, or whether they're tall or short, or these things are irrelevant for the questions that this world is designed to address. Now, I did an exercise a few years ago that Eve knows about. It was done for a big supermarket chain in Britain called Sainsbury's, and they wanted to understand about the dynamics of the shoppers that come through one of their markets. They had a lot of data on the demographics of their customers, and there were different types of customers, young, unmarried people, pensioners, people with big families, and so on. And they had different kinds of shopping lists. So for that exercise, the only thing that actually mattered, when you came right down to it, was what is their shopping list. It didn't matter anything about nothing else mattered about them, was other than what it is that they intended to buy when they came into that market. And so we had to figure out, well, how do they move through the store? Where are the best places to put the diet colas and the meat section and 1,000 other things like that? But it was all driven by only the shopping list. And the shopping list, of course, was determined by the demographics. Now, the question that you asked about the model being adaptive, I'm not exactly sure what you meant by that, whether the world, this model itself adjusts, or whether the agents themselves are adaptive inside the model.
I mean, if the model is living, I mean, if the model needs data now, if the model is now running, because if you want to sell something to Finland, you have to have the data up to yesterday to be able to provide something which will
So do you mean when new information comes available, does it sort of reconfigure itself in some way? It depends on the model. That insurance one, the reconfiguration was sort of done by hand, you know, because once every, I think, 4 quarters, once a year, the simulation stops. And the decision makers, the real world agents that are represented there, they can basically, they're like traders in the market. They can look and see, how am I doing? The decisions I made a year ago, am I succeeding? Is my company making money? And so on. And they can go in and change their rules. They can change their rules, or they can change their decisions. But the model doesn't do it automatically for them. They have to do it from the outside, like steering a plane. Okay. Now, the second question you asked, I think it was really, how do you evaluate this kind of a model? And I have a term that I use for that question. I call it the "can you trust it" question. And it basically is, I'll call it model validation. If you see in this world something happening that is, well, I'll say, interesting, if, say, it's a traffic system, congestion or some other kind of thing, to what degree can you believe that that same phenomena will appear in the real world version that this model is supposed to be representing? Okay, that's how I think of that question. And so you ask yourself, is this really an intrinsic property of the system, or is it an artifact maybe of some peculiar set of starting conditions, or some assumption that you made in the model? Because now that question actually is a much broader one. I mean, it's a question about modeling in general. It's not about agent-based models. It's about mathematical models. It's about models of airplane wings in wind tunnels and so on. To what degree does the real system mimic, or the model mimic, the real system? And generally speaking, I think that there are roughly 2 different ways that we try and address that. The first one is an obvious one. If you have any data from the real system, does the model, under seemingly identical circumstances, does the model behave roughly the same way that the real system does? I mean, you don't demand that the data be perfect, that the match be perfect, but is there a strong family resemblance, if you like, between what the model does and what the real system did under seemingly similar circumstances? In a different presentation, I would have shown you a picture like that, but that's the agreement with the data question. The second aspect, and I think it's even more important personally, is to bring people who have spent their whole lives living with the real system, whether they're supermarket managers or traffic design engineers or managers of insurance companies, and you sit them down and you say, now here are the circumstances. What do you think is going to happen? And you turn this system on and something happens. And if something takes place in the simulated system that they didn't expect, then you ask them, well, can you explain this? does it make sense, you know, when you think about it, even though you didn't expect it? It's a little bit like in evolutionary biology. When new species come into existence, we don't really know exactly when an eco-niche is empty, exactly what kind of species is going to appear, but after it does appear, often you can explain, and you said, oh yes, of course, the natural selection needed this kind of an organism and not something else. So if people who have a lot of practical experience with the systems see behavior that they say, oh yes, now I understand why that happened, even if they could not have predicted it, then you get confidence that this is a good model. Those are the two ways. Okay?
Theo had a question, and I think that needs to be the last before we get to our next session.
Okay, I'll try to make it a little bit compact. But when you talked about movie worlds, and I don't play the games actually myself, but I could imagine if I were in a certain situation where I needed, doesn't games very quickly.
Yeah.
How would I find the rules for that game that would simulate in such a way that I would get the best possible answer or possible I need? And I was reflecting while you talked about that there are some ways of modeling that can produce something like rules, but only when applied on a case. Then those procedures come very close to producing rules, but not otherwise. If you look at these methods abstractly, they don't look as rules. But when they're applied on a case, then you can see that okay, these would be the rules in a way. I'm not trying to make points like we should be doing class history or anything like that. That rules are really bound up to cases. But on the other hand, there would be to make very general and generic rules would probably misfire in a number of cases. And so I'm wondering, do you believe that it's possible to let's say. I would imagine that in some situations, to come up with good rules for games would be very valuable. And I'm wondering how do you go about determining the rules?
Oh yeah, well, that's a good question. The answer is a lot simpler than the question, truthfully. The way that in all the exercises that I've participated in, how do you find the rules? Because that's the starting point. If for an agent-based model, if you don't have a set of, let's say, realistic rules for the agents, you don't get started. The whole process stops right there. It doesn't go any farther. Now, where do you go to get these rules? Well, in the insurance business, we went to the insurers to get the rules. We said, under these circumstances, what do you do? And why do you do it? And so that's what you mean by a rule. It doesn't necessarily have to be a mathematical formula. It usually isn't. But it's a rule of action. In the football situation, you say, you ask some player, well, in these circumstances, what actions do you take? Do you move this way? Do you do something else? And so on. For traffic, road traffic, the road traffic literature is filled with articles about experiments that people have done about drivers and what do they do under different circumstances. So this is where you get the rules. I don't think that there's any substitute for this, for actually going to either the literature or experts from the field and asking them, what do you do? That's where the rules come from.
Thank you very much.
Just a rigid rejoinder, because I would imagine I would have a problem as an anthropologist when I ask people the rules too, and then I see that they do something else in those situations.
Yeah. That's okay. Then if you see that in fact they do something different than what they say they do, which sometimes is the case, then you have to adjust the rules.
I find that there are two classes of rules that are getting from informants.
Yeah.
There are the rules that they can play by,
Yeah.
and there are rules that produce rules. And those rules are clear.
Rules for changing rules.
And rules for generating rules.
Or for generating rules, yes.
Given the situation.
Yeah, yeah.
And then we need to be quite close to that situation to see how they generate rules.
Yeah. Well, one thing, I'll go back to the statement I made at the beginning, and that is that this is not a universal methodology. So there are some cases, if you can't provide the appropriate inputs, which in this case means meaningful rules, then you need to use something else.
I think like you, Theo, I feel very uncomfortable about the idea of rules. What assures me is the way that John qualified it when he said that they need to be adaptive, and you can actually not only find a different one, but actually invent one.
Yeah.
Because they don't have the status of an unchanging law. And I think that is part of the problem. And again, we come back to language, that the rule we associate with something that is inalienable and unchanging. But I think it's the point of, are they principles that guide action?
That's it. Yeah, I mean, it's probably it gives a misleading view to call them rules. It would probably be better to call them policies or something of that kind.
I think the word
Yeah.
is difficult. Right, thank you, John. Thank you
Okay.
very